The thing that affected his health the most is his obesity. He had increasingly a problem with his legs. He also suffered from constipation. He developed a lot of ulcers. He may have had some problems with insulin deficiency.
For centuries, people believed Henry VIII was resting peacefully inside a sealed royal tomb. But that wasn't the full story. When archaeologists finally opened the hidden chamber beneath St. George's Chapel, what they saw shocked everyone. The vault looked nothing like the history books described. And what lay inside changed everything we thought we knew. Stay with us until the end, and don't forget to subscribe for more unbelievable history stories. Here is Henry VIII tomb, and they know that inside it are the bodies of Henry VIII and Jane Seymour. That is an interesting topic on its own, because there is a lost tomb of Henry VIII. Henry VIII spent the last years of his life in a state that shocked everyone around him. Reports from the Tudor court, the royal household that lived and worked around the king, describe a ruler who could barely move without help. His once athletic body had grown so large that specially built lifting devices were needed simply to raise him from his bed. His legs were covered in deep ulcers that refused to heal. And according to eyewitness accounts, the smell from the infected wounds filled entire rooms before he even entered. Some physicians later suggested that he may have suffered from a metabolic condition that affected his weight and circulation, although this remains speculation. What is certain is that his body was failing rapidly, and the king, who once rode confidently into tournaments, now lived with constant pain and exhaustion. Several courtiers even wrote that he looked close to death long before he took his final breath. When Henry died in January 1547, the embalmers who prepared royal bodies faced a situation far beyond what their varied methods could handle. Tudor embalming practices were not fully standardized. Most preparations relied on spices, oils, alcohol, and layers of linen wrappings to slow decay. These measures could delay natural decomposition in a normal body, but they offered little control over a corpse that had already begun to break down before death. Henry's size created an even greater challenge, and his body required a much larger coffin lined with thick sheets of lead. Lead coffins were meant to contain smell and fluids, but they also trapped gases. As the body decomposed, those gases built pressure inside the sealed container and turned the coffin into something that could easily crack or burst. The trouble began during Henry's funeral procession. The body was moved from Whitehall, the royal palace in London, to Windsor Castle, the monarch's burial site. On the way, the procession stopped at Sion Abbey, a religious house near London. According to several accounts, something disturbing happened there. It was reported that dark fluid seeped from the coffin and pooled onto the floor. Some later chroniclers even claimed that dogs entered the hall and licked at the liquid before attendants chased them away, while others insisted the incident was a divine warning meant to reflect God's disapproval of the king's actions during his life. Whether exaggerated or not, these reports show how uneasy people felt about the state of the king's body. Henry was placed in a temporary vault inside St. George's Chapel. This was meant to be a short-term arrangement, because during his life, he had expected to be moved later into the enormous tomb he had been planning for years. Jane Seymour, the wife who had given him his only legitimate son, was already in the same vault, because Henry had chosen her as his eternal companion. But even before the vault was sealed, there were quiet concerns. Some attendants felt the burial had been rushed, and that something about the coffin seemed wrong. A few believed the king's body was already reacting to the pressure forming inside the lead casing. These worries were soon dismissed and eventually forgotten once the stone was set in place. But the uneasy burial left behind questions that would not return until many generations later. While Henry's body decomposed in ways Tudor embalmers could barely understand, an even stranger story was already forming above ground. It was tied to a tomb he spent decades designing but never lived to see completed. Henry VIII did not just want a tomb. He wanted a monument so grand it would overshadow every other royal burial in England. His father already rested in a stunning chapel at Westminster Abbey, but that simply was not enough for Henry. Historians say he imagined something bigger, darker, and far more commanding. a tomb that would send a clear message to future kings that none of them had ever equaled his power. Cardinal Wolsey had once stood as the most powerful church official in England and one of Henry's closest and most trusted advisors. But when he fell out of favor, everything he owned was claimed by the crown. Among the possessions taken was his unfinished tomb. Henry seized it without hesitation and treated it as nothing more than starting material. Wolsey had planned a striking monument for his own burial. But when Henry examined it, he dismissed it as far too modest for a king. He demanded a new design, larger, heavier, and packed with even more religious figures. The tomb would be covered in black marble, surrounded by gilded angels, prophets, apostles, and full-size statues of Henry and Jane Seymour laid out in royal splendor. The project began on a scale so massive it surprised even those accustomed to royal extravagance. Artists were brought in from Italy. Highly skilled sculptors and metalworkers were employed. Plans were redrawn and refined again and again as Henry insisted on additional details. More statues and stronger symbols of triumph. A life-sized figure of Henry was cast while he was still alive, ensuring that in death he would appear as a ruler who had never faded or grown weak. Workshops near Westminster filled with carved columns, enormous candlesticks, and long decorative panels depicting religious stories alongside scenes of royal authority. The monument existed in fragments, carefully stored and waiting for the moment they would be assembled into a structure grand enough to dominate its own chapel. But that moment never arrived. War demanded enormous funds, and Henry's campaigns against France and Scotland emptied the treasury. Records suggest that payments to craftsmen slowed and eventually stopped altogether. The Italian sculptors returned to their homeland. Assistants were dismissed. The unfinished masterpiece remained boxed and forgotten as attention shifted toward ships, soldiers, and defensive walls. When Henry finally died, his will still described the tomb as nearly complete. He had written those words earlier, at a time when he believed the construction was steadily advancing. In truth, by the end of his life, no one was working on it anymore. His children inherited the crown, Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I, but none of them inherited his fixation on the monument. Each had urgent crises and political struggles of their own. None chose to spend precious time or money finishing a grand tribute meant only to glorify their father's ego. Gradually, the pieces were sold off, reused elsewhere, or melted down. Sections of the structure were incorporated into the tomb of another national hero. Other fragments vanished into churches across the continent. What was once meant to become the greatest royal tomb in English history slowly fell apart in silence, while Henry himself rested in a plain vault that had never been intended as his permanent resting place. As his dream monument disappeared piece by piece, the vault that held him began its own quiet transformation, turning into a mystery that England would, over time, almost completely forget. When Henry VIII was first lowered into the vault beneath the choir of St. George's Chapel, everyone present knew exactly where that chamber was located. Members of the clergy stood solemnly around the opening. Royal officials observed as the heavy stone was placed back over the king. The craftsmen who had constructed the vault could have pointed out its position without the slightest doubt. Yet even at that moment, the burial was not intended to be final, and that one decision quietly shaped everything that followed. Because the chamber was considered temporary, no visible marker was carved into the floor, no engraved inscription was added, and no precise plan was carefully preserved for future generations. The vault was sealed with a clear expectation that Henry would eventually be transferred to the vast monument he had designed for himself. But that long-promised day never arrived, and over time the certainty of the vault's exact location began to fade into confusion. As the decades rolled on, the chapel itself went through repeated changes. Monarchs used it for grand ceremonies. New choir stalls were fitted into place. Old stone slabs were lifted, shifted, and laid down again. Repairs became necessary during periods of political unrest, particularly when religious institutions were reorganized and important records were lost, destroyed, or quietly removed. Some historical accounts suggest that even the clergy serving there began offering uncertain answers when visitors asked where Henry had been buried. They would say he rested somewhere beneath the choir, yet none could confidently point to the precise stone. Meanwhile, daily life inside the chapel carried on without interruption. Worshippers knelt in prayer. Choir boys rehearsed their hymns. Visitors, officials, and travelers crossed the floor without realizing they were walking directly above the remains of a king who had broken from Rome and permanently altered England's religious future. Nothing about the floor distinguished Henry's grave from the many stones surrounding it. The vault had effectively vanished while remaining in plain view. Superstition only deepened the mystery. Many believed that disturbing a royal grave could invite terrible misfortune. Others quietly claimed that the ground beneath the choir felt unsettled and should be left untouched. These fears discouraged any serious attempt to search for the exact burial spot. Over time, some even assumed that Henry's grand tomb must have been completed elsewhere, and that his body had surely been moved. The thought that he still lay in a modest, unmarked chamber seemed almost impossible to accept. Gradually, collective memory dimmed. The vault slipped out of practical knowledge, sealed beneath layers of stone, shifting history and silence. It remained concealed for generations until a sudden political crisis forced officials to reopen and rediscover the forgotten chamber. That crisis would come with the dramatic downfall of Charles I, whose violent fate would unexpectedly intersect with Henry's legacy in a way no one could have foreseen. When Charles I was executed, England stepped into a time of deep uncertainty and strain. Parliament worried that his grave might turn into a rallying point for loyal supporters who still saw him as their rightful king. They were determined to prevent that from happening. His burial, they decided, had to pass without attention. There would be no grand procession, no public mourning, and no elaborate ceremony. His body needed to be placed somewhere quickly, somewhere secure, tightly controlled, and unlikely to draw crowds. Windsor Castle was the obvious choice. The fortress was heavily guarded, safely removed from the unrest in London, and firmly under parliamentary control. According to several accounts, officials searched the castle grounds for a location that would still be considered appropriate for a king, yet remain discreet and out of sight. During that urgent search, someone recalled an old mention of a vault beneath the choir of St. George's Chapel. The reference was vague and almost forgotten, but it seemed suitable. When workers lifted the stone slabs and looked inside, they realized they had stumbled upon the long-lost burial chamber of Henry VIII. The vault had remained unopened for generations. Inside, Henry VIII and Jane Seymour rested undisturbed in the darkness. There was no time for hesitation or ceremony. Charles's coffin was brought forward immediately. The task that followed was tense and uncomfortable. It was winter, and the cold inside the chapel was biting. The lighting was dim, and the men were under strict orders to complete the burial swiftly to avoid drawing attention. They were not allowed the careful, measured handling normally given to royal remains. Charles's lead coffin was enormously heavy, and the vault itself was far too cramped to make the process easy. The workers had to lift, tilt, and maneuver the coffin into position with force. In doing so, they inevitably shifted the other coffins already inside the narrow space. Later examinations conducted many years afterward suggested that the wooden supports beneath Henry VIII's coffin may have been strained or even broken during this hurried operation. Some observers later believed that Henry's massive lead coffin, already under pressure from internal gases, might have cracked or become unstable at that very moment. Charles I was placed only inches away from Henry VIII, a pairing filled with striking irony. One king had pushed royal authority to extraordinary heights. The other had fought fiercely to defend that same authority and ultimately lost his life because of it. Several historians argue that placing them side by side unintentionally symbolized England's long and painful struggle with absolute monarchy. Others insist it was simply a practical decision made during a chaotic and dangerous time, without any deeper message intended. Once Charles's coffin was finally settled, the vault was sealed again. It now held two monarchs resting in uneasy proximity. The disturbances caused during that rushed burial left behind hidden structural damage that went unnoticed for years. Only when the vault was opened again long afterward would the effects of that winter night become impossible to overlook. And yet the secret burial of Charles I was only the beginning of the vault's strange story. When it was eventually exposed once more, what the next witnesses discovered inside would leave them stunned. The rediscovery of Henry VIII vault did not begin with archaeologists or royal historians carefully studying old records. It started with ordinary laborers carrying out routine repairs inside St. George's Chapel. According to contemporary reports, they were lifting and resetting aging stone slabs near the choir when one particular slab shifted in an unusual way. Before anyone could steady it, the stone suddenly gave way and dropped inward. A dark opening appeared beneath their feet, exposing a silent space that had not been seen for generations. The workers froze in place. Some instinctively stepped back in alarm, while others cautiously leaned forward, trying to make sense of the unexpected void below them. A wave of cold, stale air rose from the darkness, and one worker later claimed it felt as though the vault had released a long, trapped breath. After centuries of stillness, lanterns were quickly lowered through the opening. In the flickering light, a cramped burial chamber came into view, holding 3 large lead coffins. Officials were summoned immediately. When the first royal attendants arrived and peered inside, they identified the coffin of Jane Seymour resting along one side. It appeared undisturbed and tightly sealed. Nearby lay the coffin of Charles I, aged but solid and intact. The third coffin, placed at the center of the vault, belonged to Henry VIII. As the lantern light shifted toward Henry's coffin, the atmosphere inside the chapel noticeably changed. His coffin looked entirely different from the others. It rested at a sharp angle, as if it had slipped or collapsed. The wooden supports meant to hold it steady had completely failed. The lead casing had split along multiple seams, and long cracks stretched across its surface. Certain sections appeared warped, as though pressure from within had forced the metal outward. Unverified accounts from that day suggest that several observers instinctively stepped back upon seeing the damage, either stunned by the sight or fearful that the weakened structure might shift again. Royal officials were called within hours, and physicians accompanied them because no one could predict the condition of Henry's remains. The chapel, usually alive with soft echoes and quiet movement, fell into a heavy and uneasy silence. Nearly everyone who approached the opening described the same unsettling sensation. The vault felt strained and fragile, as though the slightest disturbance could trigger further collapse. After examining the scene, officials made a swift decision to reseal the chamber. They documented the visible condition of the coffins, but refused to open Henry's any further. Their reasoning was direct. The vault appeared unstable, and attempting to examine the damaged coffin might cause the entire chamber to give way. The decision was carried out without delay. The stone covering was carefully lowered back into place, and the vault returned to darkness. Yet even those present that day did not uncover the full reality of what lay inside. 75 years later, during a formal investigation conducted under controlled conditions, a far more disturbing discovery would finally come to light within Henry VIII's shattered tomb. When officials finally authorized a formal survey of the vault beneath St. George's Chapel, only a small circle of trusted individuals were permitted to take part. Contemporary accounts explain that a surveyor was lowered into the chamber to measure the space and carefully record everything he observed. He carried a lamp, a measuring line, and a compact toolkit. Everyone else remained above the opening in complete silence. The atmosphere inside the chapel felt strained and heavy, as though the building itself were holding its breath. The surveyor began on the right side of the vault. The coffin of Jane Seymour rested there, straight and undisturbed. It had been sealed with care, and the lead casing showed no visible signs of pressure or weakness. Close by, the coffin of Charles I appeared aged but structurally sound. Despite the rough handling during his secret winter burial, the metal remained firm and intact. Nothing about either coffin hinted at serious damage or disruption. Then the surveyor turned his lamp toward the center of the chamber, and the situation shifted dramatically. the coffin of Henry VIII was in catastrophic condition. The massive lead shell had buckled, split, and collapsed in several sections. The wooden supports beneath it had completely failed, leaving the coffin leaning at an unnatural angle against the wall of the vault. Deep cracks stretched across the metal surface, and portions appeared twisted outward, as if intense pressure from inside had forced the lead apart. When the surveyor leaned closer, he noticed exposed bone near one of the ruptured seams. The bone was thick and heavy, still attached to scraps of fabric and flakes of torn lead. Later, historians suggested this was likely part of Henry's leg, driven outward by the same internal pressure that shattered the coffin. As he examined the floor near the collapsed supports, the surveyor noticed smaller shapes mixed among splintered wood and fragments of lead. What initially looked like debris turned out to include pale, jointed pieces. His notes described short bones, possibly from fingers, and what appeared to be part of a hand. The possibility that fragments of Henry's remains had been forced out and scattered across the vault floor shocked everyone who later read the report. Then came an even more unsettling observation. In a narrow gap between the coffins, in a position that did not correspond to any recorded burial, the surveyor identified another cluster of bones. These were separate from Henry's exposed remains. They were not near Jane Seymour, nor close enough to Charles I to have come from his coffin. There was no casket, no identifying plaque, and no written entry in chapel records. The bones simply lay there, loose, silent, and belonging to an unknown individual. This unexplained discovery created a mystery that has never been conclusively resolved. One final detail disturbed officials reviewing the report. Near a crack in Henry's damaged coffin, the surveyor recorded a patch of dark, hardened residue on the stone floor. He described it as a thick stain that had dried over time. Several historians later noted that its appearance closely matched accounts of a dark fluid reported during Henry's funeral procession near Sion Abbey. Some experts believe the substance may have seeped from the coffin long before the vault was sealed for the last time. Others argue that pressure inside the lead casing could have forced it out gradually over decades. The similarity between the two reports deeply unsettled those who studied the findings. After this investigation, the vault was no longer viewed simply as a damaged royal chamber. It became a forensic enigma, a scene of fractured coffins, displaced remains, and unanswered questions. Some historians suggest the extra bones were accidentally moved during earlier renovation work and quietly left in the chamber without documentation. Others believe the rushed placement of Charles I coffin may have disturbed remains from a nearby burial. A smaller number propose a darker possibility, that someone was secretly placed in the vault during a period of political fear, assuming it would remain sealed forever. The theories differ, but the physical record remains unchanged. Henry VIII does not rest intact in a grand monument. He lies in a shattered coffin with a leg bone pushed through torn lead. Finger bones scattered across the floor, unidentified, remains beside him, and a dark stain echoing the final journey of his funeral. For a ruler who sought absolute control, his resting place became a scene of disorder he could never have foreseen. The findings inside the vault prompted historians and medical researchers to re-examine Henry VIII's final years with renewed focus. The exposed leg bone, described as unusually thick and dense, appeared to support long-standing theories that Henry suffered from extreme swelling and chronic infection late in life. Some medical specialists observed that its structure aligned with historical descriptions of pain, so severe it left him struggling to walk. The vault had unintentionally preserved physical evidence that matched written Tudor accounts. Fragments of cloth still clinging to the bone added another unexpected layer to the investigation. They indicated that portions of Henry's burial garments had survived longer than normally expected in a damp underground chamber. Some researchers theorized that the collapse of the coffin had pressed the fabric tightly against the bone, slowing decay. Others suggested that the oils and spices used in Tudor embalming practices may have altered how the materials decomposed. These remnants provided rare insight into burial methods of the period, details that are often lost to time. The unidentified bones, however, sparked the most intense debate. They did not correspond to Henry VIII, Jane Seymour, or Charles I. Some experts propose that the remains may have belonged to a cleric originally buried beneath the chapel floor and accidentally disturbed during earlier renovations. Others argued that during periods of civil unrest, displaced remains might have been placed temporarily in the vault for safekeeping. A smaller group advanced a more troubling theory, that someone was secretly interred there during a political crisis, trusting the sealed chamber would never be reopened. Without another official examination, none of these theories can be confirmed, which leads to the lingering question: should the vault beneath St. George's Chapel be opened again to uncover the truth, or should its remaining secrets remain undisturbed forever?